primary sources for us are ways to practice doing what historians do. 8th graders aren't historians, 12th graders aren't historians. So it's the silly mistake that says, we need to do exactly what the experts do so that we become experts. We actually need to do what the experts did before they were experts so that they became experts, which means learn a lot of stories.
Welcome to the History Matters podcast. I'm your host, Barbara Davidson, President of Standards Work and Executive Director of the Knowledge Matters campaign. Today I'm sharing my conversation with John Bassett and Gary Shiffman, two former high school social studies teachers who have recently left the classroom. They're building a history curriculum around principles in their groundbreaking book called From Story to Judgment, the 4-question method for teaching and learning social studies. During this interview, John and Gary unpack the 4 questions in their method and help listeners not just understand them, but also appreciate why these questions should shape curriculum design. I think you'll really enjoy this episode. What do you want to share with our listeners about, what connects your background to History Matters and the History Matters campaign's focus on elementary history instruction? So what are two high school social studies dudes doing here?
So our story, our 4QM story, starts when John hired me in 2002 to be a high school teacher. I was 39 years old. I was an ex-academic. And I thought, I can figure out this high school history thing. And John wasn't so sure, but he hired me anyway. And to show my thanks for him taking a risk on me, I immediately started hounding him. Why in the world would kids need to know all of that stuff in that textbook, in those standards, in those documents he gave me as a new teacher? They got to learn all this stuff in world history, 9th and 10th grade. I'm like, it's too much stuff. It's not interesting. It's not relevant. I was a pain in the butt for him because I kept saying, the thing he's asking me to do doesn't make any sense. So that became an argument that went on for years, literally a decade of arguing about fundamental purpose. Like, what are we doing when we teach kids history?
Yeah, it was a very fruitful argument. He said that the kids didn't need to know any stories about the past. They just needed to know underlying principles about the way the world works. I told him that underlying principles are boring and that kids need to know some stories about the world, the country, the community that they live in. And that's the only argument with Gary that I've ever actually won. He's won all the subsequent arguments. But basically, we set out to try to X-ray the discipline and figure out what are we doing when we teach history and social studies well. And the first problem we tried to solve was the one Gary articulated, which is, wait a minute. I have all this stuff. How do I fit this stuff into a lesson, a unit, a course in a way that's not just a pile of facts and lists? And so that was what led us to the idea of creating stories and taking your lists of content and shaping them into historical stories. And then one of our slogans is story first. Everything flows from that.
Love it. Okay, so I think we should probably quickly share the 4 questions of this 4-question method.
So question 1 is, what happened? Which sounds ridiculously simple. What happened is the question you ask when you want to hear the story of something interesting. So when you teach history, there's lots of interesting stuff happened. And when you tell somebody about it, like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. Yeah, that's a great story, right? So working backwards, what we figured out was what happened is like the question. It's the basic question that drives all social studies instruction. Big claim, but we think it's true. If you ask a good, specific what happened, what you'll get is a really good, coherent story that leaves a lot of stuff out.
Question 2 asks, what were they thinking? We slow down the story, we pause the story, we try to get into the heads of the people who made that story move in the way that it did, and we try to understand them on their own terms. And when we do that, we're practicing the skill of interpretation. We can't talk to these people directly, so we have to interpret artifacts they've left behind, whether that's text or an object or a pattern of behavior. And we try to understand the people in the story and figure out what were they thinking. So that's question 2.
Question 3 asks us to step back from the specifics of the story. We've heard what happened. We've told the story of what happened, and we've gotten into the heads of some of the key players in the story. But all of that stuff is happening in a particular time and place. And the conditions under which it's happening probably influence what actually happened in the story. Some societies have revolutions, but they don't have them all the time, and not all societies have them. why did the Canadian colonies stay with Great Britain, but the 13 colonies below them decided to stage a war of revolution? And that asks kids to think in a more sophisticated way about the specific story and say, wow, stories like this, they happen sometimes and not others. Why then? Why there?
So once you've done all three questions, you can get to question 4, which is what do we think about that? And that's where you get to exercise the skill of judgment. And that's where we ask students to say, okay, looking at the story and the players and the context and conditions, who do we admire? Who do we not admire? Who do we think did the right thing? Who do we think did the wrong thing?
Questions 1 and 2 come first. Questions 3 and 4 are more challenging and come later. And one way to think about it is simply density of knowledge. To come up with a good answer to a question about under what conditions do societies have revolutions, you kind of need to know a bunch of stories, right? Or take this one, a favorite one, which can be done in any grade. The great civilizations from the pre-modern world, from the ancient world that we study, Sumer and Mesopotamia and the Yellow River, they're all river valley civilizations, and every kid who learns about them knows that. Why are they all by rivers? That's question 3. But it doesn't make sense to ask or answer it until you've actually learned about a bunch of them. Like, oh yeah, I see the pattern. So that's a level up. Question 4 is interesting because a lot of people think it's simpler than it is. Anybody who runs a debate in the classroom says, Truman, good or bad? And there's yelling on one side and there's yelling on another. That's true. That's a debate and that may be hot and engaging, but that is not judgment. Judgment is the capacity to generalize from your specific reaction to a case and to say, hold on, what are the general features of this case? And how can I make a rule to guide my own behavior in the world so that I know when to support the revolution and when not to? Because that's what's at stake in judgment.
So the big insight of the 4-question method is that every good history or social studies lesson is actually focused on one of these 4 questions. And the clarity that's achieved by understanding that these are the 4 questions that define the discipline, the clarity that's achieved for teachers and students is just game changing.
Could you comment on the extent to which you think that progression? It's one of the things that I think is so impressive about the 4-question method. And I note that it sounds a little bit like historical thinking skills. Am I right about that?
You're dead right. You're dead right. The first problem we tried to solve was how do we get all this giant content list into a coherent unit or a coherent course? The second problem that we set out to solve was how do we take those lists of historical thinking skills, which are long and difficult to understand and disconnected from content, how do we make those actually real in the room? Because we all agree that we don't just want kids to tell a story back. We want them to be able to think about the story. Gary likes to say we take the story apart and put it back together. And each question has a thinking skill associated with it. And if you can do good narration, interpretation, explanation, and judgment, you will find that in doing that, you will sweep up all those other historical thinking skills that the College Board or New Visions or everybody has all these lists of historical thinking skills. There are really only 4: narration, interpretation, explanation, and judgment.
So let's push on this a little bit more. You all are in the throes of writing a curriculum, and you're, I think, just beginning to do that at the elementary level. So do you find that young people are really able to get into the mindset of people from the past?
Yes, they absolutely can. So we're high school guys, and we just finished an 8th grade curriculum, which we beta tested widely in classrooms. But even before that, a mind-expanding experience for us was a brilliant young woman named Emma Colonna, who reached out to us. She was the curriculum director for elementary and middle school at a charter school in Tennessee. And she said, my kids can do history. I know they can, but we don't have a way to make them do it. And so I'm really interested in what you guys do. Can you help us with curriculum? And we ended up writing units for her. And every single one of those units had question 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. They had lessons on narration, interpretation, explanation, and judgment, and kids could do it. We took Natalie Wexler, actually, for a demonstration of one of the lessons, and she saw kids have a discussion about Chief Joseph, who was a Lakota Sioux leader who was faced with a terrible decision about whether to fight what would almost certainly be a losing battle, and he decided he would not. And the kids in the room, they knew a lot, they knew the story, they knew about this guy, and they got to deliberate toward judgment about whether Chief Joseph made the right choice or not. They can do that in fourth and fifth grade. Absolutely.
One thing about that, and thinking about especially elementary teachers, I had a conversation with an elementary teacher once who was like, I know social studies is important, but I just don't know how to do it. And, I think that's something that we can help with. And I think there's a lot of people who are coming around to this that like, oh, you know what you can do? You just need to teach kids to ask and answer these 4 questions. Oh, I can design activities around that. They're elementary teachers. But, we're moving away from, social studies is we're going to make stovepipe hats out of construction paper because Abe Lincoln wore a stovepipe hat. That's an arts and crafts activity. That's not social studies. And I think that stuff is starting to fade. And another example of this is, my daughter teaches first grade, and she had the experience that I think a lot of early grade elementary teachers have, which she got what she called the list curriculum. One of her social studies units was American symbols, the flag, the Liberty Bell, the eagle. She's like, well, what do I do with this? And we talked it over, and she was like, oh, all these symbols come out of the American Revolution. I'll make it into a unit about the American Revolution. So she storified the unit. It went great. Kids are playing redcoats and patriots on the playground and telling their parents what's going on at the Boston Tea Party at dinner. And so, you give people like a list of American symbols, it's boring. But story of the American Revolution, yeah, first graders can do that. Absolutely.
So I want to shift to one of my pet peeves. You all have heard me talk at length about my concern that a lot of the social studies curriculum that we've been looking at lately seems to put this outsized emphasis on teaching through primary sources, almost as if using the primary source is the purpose of the exercise. So do you guys have thoughts about the best use of primary sources, and I think particularly with young students?
I was once asked to give a demonstration lesson for a job, and these were 10th graders who were going to read the Articles of Confederation and annotate them for context. And I was like, why would we read the Articles of Confederation? And how do you annotate for context? It didn't make any sense to me. And so there's stuff like that all over the place. You see this also in curricula that will have a class period, and they'll give kids 6 primary source documents to deal with in a class period. It's like, well, you can't deal with any of them very seriously if you have that many in that little time. You're teaching kids to skim and fake it.
We read documents because they're meaningful artifacts. Well, why do we want to do that? Because we have a question called question 2. What were they thinking? We can't call them up and chat with them. We can't know the people of the past any other way than using those documents. But built into our method is the idea that you need to know the story before you get to the document. If a curriculum begins with the primary source, the first question you have to ask yourself is, what story do the kids already know? What are you presuming the kids already know to make that an interesting document so that they can ask question 2? They must already know that person and what story they were involved in. Otherwise, it makes no sense. By the way, what experts do is what we want our kids to do, but the way you acquire a skill is not the way you deploy it when you're an expert. Musicians don't sit down and play Rachmaninoff when they're just introduced to the piano. That takes years of practice. What you have to do is learn your scales, learn where the notes are, right? Primary sources for us are ways to practice doing what historians do. 8th graders aren't historians, 12th graders aren't historians. So it's the silly mistake that says we need to do exactly what the experts do so that we become experts. We actually need to do what the experts did before they were experts so that they became experts, which means learn a lot of stories primarily, and then practice in a scaffolded way, interpreting documents when appropriate.
Love it. So is the 4-question method something that any teacher can learn about and utilize in their classroom, even though they may not have access to this curriculum that you are writing? What's the application of the method to the teacher in the classroom today?
So ideally, our answer to your question would be, we have a curriculum and we would love to share it with you. However, the reality is that we're 2 guys and we have some help and we're writing curriculum. We're getting there. But before we get all the way there are some things you can do. And the first one is the simplest of all, but if you take it seriously, it's transformative. Tell stories in class. Tell the kids they're true and teach them how to tell them back. Take every list you have, turn it into a story. Give them ways to do it. We have in our book, we talk about storyboards and because but so sentences and lots of ways, rich ways, fun ways you can get kids to tell the story back. If you do nothing other than that, you will see miracles happen in front of you. That's the advice for now, and we'll catch up with you and write curriculum.
Brilliant. I love it. I've ended each episode with a question. What gives you hope about the future of social studies instruction?
I think there are more and more people who are coming around to the fact that, oh, you know what? Kids can actually learn knowledge. And if we put knowledge first, that will lead to good outcomes and that will actually help literacy. I think that there's still a lot of holdover from the early 20th century idea that, children are only interested in things close to them and then further and further out. But if you've ever seen a 4-year-old get excited about dinosaurs or Pokemon, you know that that's demonstrably false. And so, I think there's more and more people who are coming around to the idea that, history does matter in all the grades, and we should foreground knowledge and embrace that. So I'm optimistic about that.
Yeah, I'm optimistic for the same reason. What John is saying, it's like there are things now that seem so apparent. But my favorite one is motivation. If you don't have fun activities, the kids won't be motivated. Have you never felt joy in knowing something? Have you never felt joy in demonstrable progress in acquiring a skill? Of course you have. Every human being has done this. Why would we think children wouldn't enjoy that? They want to know things. They want one of my kids went through a stage of knowing everything about the Kardashians. She loved that knowledge. The point is, people love to know things. And it feels like that's just more of, it's in the air now, it's in the culture. And I hope there's no putting it back in the bottle.
To learn more about John and Gary's work, you can visit 4qmteaching.net. We linked to their website in the show notes. This podcast is produced by the Knowledge Matters Campaign. You can learn more about our work at knowledgematterscampaign.org. To catch all of the History Matters podcast, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.